Georgie mentioned, these are preliminary results from an ongoing ECR2P project by myself and also Kesa Hinkainen, who's a University Academic Fellow at Leeds, and Ráday as well, who is a project officer at BCMAP. So the motivation for our project is for this research is quite simple. Clearly, many of the speakers have underlined how critical an issue sexual violence within civil conflict and outside of conflict is globally. And also following up on what George said earlier, it's come to be seen as that it's not an inevitable consequence of conflict, but rather that it's a political choice. The variation in sexual violence between conflicts and also, as we're testing here, within conflicts clearly demonstrates that. So we're looking at Syria and we want to explore the politicised dimensions of sexual violence. In this, one of the most protracted and frustrating conflicts of the 21st century. And we want to look at variation, within conflict variation, to try and understand when and where civilians are especially vulnerable to this type of violence. So the research questions, are looking at the variation of sexual violence within conflict, and essentially how political control, particular geographical areas, varies the identity of the victims and varies the mode of sexual violence used against them. So we're applying Kalivas's explanatory model for homicidal violence. More on this in a moment, or right now. So the control collaboration model, which we're testing and applying, explains the microdynamics of homicidal violence in civil war. In short, violence within civil conflict is seen to emerge from the ground for several reasons. First of all, political actors quickly realise that indiscriminate violence is counterproductive, particularly if they wish to govern the population afterwards. This is clearly distinct from modes of, or political actors who are undertaking wars of extermination, where clearly indiscriminate violence is utilised. And in order to enact the targeted selective violence that political actors want, they require information. And this is provided by local populations, and contrary to expectations, or rather contrary to what we might hope, this is usually very readily provided, and people will denounce neighbours and rivals in order to settle scores or gain revenge. Within this theory, there is a discrepancy between political actors who have the ability to enact violence and the willingness of local people to provide information, which means that political actors require information require violence-enabling information the most when they lack political control. And collaborators, on the other hand, are only willing to provide information when they feel it's safe to do so, i.e. when their rivals will be unable to counter-denounce them and thus to gain revenge. So the control collaboration model visualises political space over a 5-level continuum, which you can see there, from Zone 1, complete incumbent hegemony, to Zone 5, complete insurgent hegemony. And due to the unwillingness of collaborators to provide information in Zone 3, due to the ease by which their rivals will be able to denounce them to the other side due to the presence of both political actors, the front lines of civil wars will observe surprisingly little violence against civilians, as the political actors will simply lack the information required to enact violence. And likewise, Zones 1 and 5, whilst the political actors will receive very large amounts of denunciations, and especially false denunciations as well, due to their complete control, they will not see the need to utilise violence. So people denouncing on their neighbours or their rivals in Zone 1 and Zone 5 will often be disappointed in that they won't be, in effect, dragged away and shot. Accordingly, zones 2 and 4, where one political actor is almost in control, but not yet fully, and they're seeking to solidify their control, the supply of information and the willingness to utilise violence against potential opponents will overlap, and therefore these are the most dangerous zones where civilians will be exposed to the maximum threat of violence. And our hypotheses are that homicidal violence, as just outlined, should be most prevalent in zones 2 and 4. And our initial expectations would be that sexual violence, as a form of political or societal death, whereby victims, in a sense, are removed from the body politic by this act and by the symbolic and meanings attached to it, would be closely related to local dynamics and to the supply of information. Therefore, we would expect, likewise with homicidal violence, to see the highest levels of sexual violence in zones 2 and 4 overall. As with any other type of violence, sexual violence can be divided into two categories, discriminate and indiscriminate. And therefore, certain forms of sexual violence, especially mass victim attacks, we would expect to be based on an indiscriminate logic and to occur mainly in zone 3, or primarily in zone 3. And it is important to recognise that we exclude actors within this particular case study who are working to an exterminatory logic. For example, the Islamic State, who don't fit the expectations. And so the research design, this is rather technical, but as has been mentioned, data on sexual violence is extremely unreliable and very, very difficult to obtain. And likewise, data for civil wars is notoriously unreliable. And added to the fact that the conflict in Syria is still ongoing and that it's a particularly politically sensitive one can see how these difficulties were compounded in the process of the research. However, despite this challenge, it's important to attempt to understand and to develop our understandings as far as possible. So having looked at the various options, we chose the Women Under Siege project, which collects information regarding sexual violence and also registers reliable news reports. And these data were coded to present a dynamic picture of sexual violence occurrences across Syria. Zones of control coding has been even more challenging, and this is still a process we're very much in the middle of. But in the end, we've relied upon the project data from the XSUB project, which registers various event types, including protest, conflict, and many types of violence. So we have here a visualization of the distribution of sexual violence across Syria. But it's important to note at this point that the only statistics which we have which are reliable or usable in that sense are currently covering crimes perpetrated by the government. So clearly it's a very partial picture we've been able to draw so far. And looking at the empirical results, as you see, we currently must exclude zones 4 and zones 5 and also zone 3. But the data does show, surprisingly, an increase in all forms of sexual violence in zone 1 as compared to zone 2, which is contrary to our initial expectations. And breaking it down further, we can see a dramatic decrease in all different kinds of instances from zone 2 to zone 1. So we have threats of sexual violence, groping, sexual assault without penetration, detention for purposes of sexual violence, and forced entry, which would be rape. And a similar pattern can be observed in the distribution of victims. But of particular note are the high levels of vulnerability of men and especially boys in zones 1 and 2, which was something we didn't necessarily expect to find, particularly given the additional reluctance which has been alluded to by previous speakers of male victims to report to report their victimisation. So even given the fact that these victims are particularly underrepresented, it was an interesting finding. So in summary, this is, as we said, this is an ongoing research project. It's expected that the results will be further refined by a more developed methodology for coding the zones of control, which we then hope to present in February. However, even with our preliminary findings, it's very interesting that Zone 1, where there would be fewer other signs of violence, for example, there would be a lack of even anti-government protests, for example. And it's very interesting that levels of sexual violence are higher there. Although this remains to be confirmed by further refining between zones 1 and 2, what we certainly do observe already is that the higher incidence of rape and other forms of sexual violence in areas under significant political control and theoretically more stable indicates that the commonplace understandings of sexual violence are somehow intrinsic to the chaos of war, the kind of the Hobbesian argument, which has been challenged by many previous speakers, is further undermined. Whilst opportunistic rape certainly occurs in conflict, and it would appear highly likely that this is much more common than in periods of peace, understanding this as the dominant driver of such violence and us concentrating disproportionate resources and attention to what we term Zone 3, or the front lines, the most contested conflict areas, and therefore the most chaotic, removes attention from the instrumental and political logics driving rape as a weapon of war. In terms of the responsibility to protect, in preventing sexual violence, we should be looking more closely at the discursive processes which legitimise it and enable it as a political choice. And to further improve and refine the results for the final presentation in February, we are working on diversifying our data to strengthen our zones of control coding and additional robustness checks, etc. But I think I was quite under 15.